The Middle Ages are usually presented like a still painting: frozen peasants, stone castles, quiet villages, everyone politely waiting for history to happen to them. Many listen quietly here, night after night. If this calm travels with you, you may stay. Subscribing keeps this silence alive, but that image collapses the moment you listen closely. The past was never silent. It muttered, argued, prayed out loud, complained constantly, and panicked quietly in the dark. And the more you listen, the more uncomfortable the realization becomes. These people were not lost, not primitive, not waiting to be rescued by progress. They were managing uncertainty in real time, with tools that only look strange because we forgot why they existed. History textbooks prefer clean lines and dramatic events. What they leave out are the long stretches of ordinary anxiety, the nights spent awake wondering if tomorrow would bring rain or ruin, the small rituals performed not because they were logical, but because they worked just well enough to keep fear from taking over. Medieval life was not defined by ignorance, but by improvisation. Medieval life was not static. It was restless, not adventurous restless, not the kind of movement driven by curiosity or self-discovery, but the kind driven by exhaustion and quiet panic, the kind where you wake up one morning, look around, and realize that staying exactly where you are might be more dangerous than leaving everything behind. People did not move because they wanted more. They moved because they had less food, less protection, less patience from the people who owned the land beneath their feet. Harvests failed with impressive regularity. Weather did not negotiate. Soil wore out. Pests arrived uninvited and unrepentant. And when crops failed, everything else followed. Hunger sharpened tempers. Rents rose because lords rarely accepted famine as a valid excuse, and taxes were collected with the same enthusiasm regardless of whether anyone had anything left to give. Add to this the occasional army passing through, an army that did not politely request supplies but took what it needed, trampled what it did not, and left behind hoofprints, broken fences, and the medieval equivalent of an apology written entirely in destruction. When this happened, people did not protest, not because they agreed, but because complaining was a very efficient way to shorten your life expectancy. Resistance was remembered, punished, and sometimes displayed publicly. So instead of arguing, people packed, and packing in the Middle Ages was not an organized affair involving lists and luggage. It was a frantic assessment of what might keep you alive on the road. Anything not nailed down was considered negotiable: blankets, tools, sacks of grain, family heirlooms that suddenly became less important than a cooking pot. And yes, people argued about that pot, loudly, passionately, because it was heavy. But it was also the difference between eating something warm and eating nothing at all. They walked because walking was the only option. No carts for most, no horses unless you were fortunate or useful enough to deserve one, just feet, worn shoes if you were lucky, wrapped cloth if you were not. They did not walk toward opportunity or promise. They walked toward uncertainty with slightly better odds, toward places rumored to be less cursed, less taxed, less recently destroyed. Hope was not a shining destination. It was a vague rumor that somewhere else might be marginally worse tomorrow than today. Seasonal labor only intensified this constant movement. Harvest time pulled workers across regions like tides. People followed crops the way modern commuters follow paychecks. Temporary work meant temporary survival, and when the season ended, so did whatever stability it offered. Religious festivals created another kind of migration, thousands of people deciding collectively that walking for weeks to stand in a field and pray was a reasonable use of limited calories. Pilgrimages were deeply spiritual experiences, yes, but they were also logistical nightmares involving blisters, spoiled food, and the ever-present possibility of not coming back at all. Travel itself was an ordeal. Roads were not roads in the way we understand them. They were suggestions etched into mud. In winter you sank, in summer you choked on dust. Signposts were rare, maps were optimistic at best, often drawn by people who had never been where they claimed getting lost was not a mistake. It was the default condition. And yet people kept moving because staying could be worse. If your Lord suddenly remembered your existence and decided you owed more than you could pay, disappearing quietly into the landscape might save your life. Officially, medieval society liked to insist that people were legally bound to the land, tied forever to the place of their birth, but reality disagreed politely and continuously. Villages were revolving doors, new faces arrived, old ones vanished, and nobody asked too many questions because tomorrow it might be their turn to leave under cover of darkness with a sack of grain and a growing sense of regret. Stability was an illusion maintained by those with enough power to remain still. Information traveled faster than authority. Rumors moved with merchants, pilgrims, and anyone with a loud voice and flexible morals. Gossip crossed borders long before official messengers did, and by the time a royal decree arrived, everyone already knew or thought they knew what it said. Medieval people were not trapped peasants frozen in place. They were tired, mobile survivors, constantly walking away from one problem and directly into another, usually without a map and always with complaints. Borders meant very little on the ground. History loves clean lines. Medieval people stepped over them slowly, arguing the entire way. Identity was local, loyalty was practical, and survival outweighed abstract allegiance. If another lord offered slightly lower taxes or simply had not noticed you yet, that was good enough. Belonging was temporary, and permanence was a luxury few could afford. This constant movement shaped how people understood the world. Home was not a fixed point. It was a condition, something you had as long as circumstances allowed. Memory became portable. Stories carried identity when place could not. You remembered where you came from, not because you were there, but because it explained who you were to strangers who might need convincing that you were worth tolerating. The Middle Ages were not quiet, pastoral centuries of stillness. They were noisy, dusty, exhausting, full of people on the road, people waiting for something better, or at least less terrible, people who understood that history was not happening somewhere else. It was happening under their feet, pushing them forward, whether they liked it or not. And they did not like it, but they went anyway, because movement, however painful, was often the only form of control they had left. So when we imagine medieval villages as timeless and unmoving, we are projecting our own desire for simplicity onto a past that knew better. The truth is less comforting but more human. Medieval life was defined by motion, by the knowledge that nothing stayed the same long enough to trust it, that safety was provisional, and that sometimes the smartest decision was to pick up what you could carry and walk, not toward hope, but away from immediate disaster. They were not explorers, they were not pioneers, they were not chasing destiny, they were surviving geography, politics, weather, and people with swords and paperwork. They moved because standing still was a risk, and in a world where everything could change overnight, motion felt like the only honest response. The Middle Ages did not stand still. They trudged forward, one tired step at a time, muttering, complaining, and quietly refusing to disappear where they were told to stay. Medieval romance. When loving someone required a third party, ink, and a great deal of patience. Love existed in the Middle Ages, there is no doubt about that. Hearts still raced, longing still kept people awake at night, jealousy still burned just as hot, but the ability to write those feelings down was a privilege reserved for a very small, very specific group of people, and unfortunately for everyone else, they were not usually the ones falling desperately in love. Most medieval people could feel deeply, passionately, irrationally. But when it came to putting those feelings into words on parchment, they were suddenly helpless, standing there with a heart full of emotion and no practical way to deliver it. Literacy was rare, expensive, and tightly guarded. Reading and writing were skills taught primarily to clergy, nobles, and the occasional town official who enjoyed reminding everyone of it. For the majority of the population, words lived in the mouth, not on the page. This meant that romance, which modern people tend to imagine as private, intimate, and carefully curated, became an oddly public affair the moment it needed to travel farther than shouting distance. If you loved someone and wanted them to know, truly know in a way that felt permanent and serious, you needed help, professional help, specifically the kind that came with ink stains on the fingers and vows of celibacy. So you went to a scribe or a clerk or a monk, someone who knew how to turn spoken feelings into written form, someone who understood the formal rules of correspondence, and you did not write your letter, you dictated it. Out loud, slowly, carefully, while another human being sat across from you, listening to every confession with the emotional detachment of someone copying a grocery list. It was not romantic in the modern sense. It was vulnerable, awkward, and deeply humbling because there is something uniquely uncomfortable about whispering your deepest longings to a man who has renounced desire entirely and is currently judging your sentence structure. You might begin with confidence, your voice steady as you say something like, "My heart burns for her," and the scribe would pause, quill hovering, eyes narrowing slightly as he asked a necessary clarifying question. Burns in a spiritual sense, or burns in a way that suggests immediate medical concern. Precision mattered not because the scribe cared about your feelings, but because words, once written, had a habit of lasting longer than intended, and nobody wanted to accidentally declare heresy or scandal in what was meant to be a love letter. Medieval love letters followed rules, strict ones. Romance was not free form. It had a structure, an expected rhythm borrowed heavily from classical texts and religious language. You began with praise, not of yourself, never of yourself, but of the beloved. Her virtue, her beauty, her moral excellence, followed by a declaration of devotion that balanced passion with restraint, vows of loyalty, promises of patience, and dramatic flourishes that compared her to light, dawn, roses, or divine grace. These metaphors were not optional, they were the grammar of love, and if you struggled to find the right comparison, the scribe would helpfully suggest one, offering a small menu of acceptable, poetic exaggerations. Would you like her beauty compared to the morning sun, the purity of a lily, or the radiance of heavenly light? He might ask, as though taking an order. Romance had formatting requirements, and originality was less important than correctness. Too much passion risked impropriety. Too little suggested indifference. The letter needed to sound sincere, but also respectable, emotional, but not unhinged. This balance was difficult enough without an audience, yet medieval lovers had no choice but to perform it aloud. The situation became even more complicated in small communities where anonymity was a fantasy, not a reality. The scribe often knew both parties. He might have baptized her as an infant, taught her cousin to read, heard gossip about her family, and quite possibly knew that she was already promised to someone else. Professional discretion was encouraged, but professional silence was more a hope than a guarantee. And even when scribes kept their mouths shut, their faces often revealed more than they intended. A raised eyebrow, a pause too long, a sigh that said far more than words ever could. Over time, patterns emerged. Scribes wrote many love letters, dozens each year, and while they did not intentionally reuse phrases, habits formed, metaphors repeated themselves. Certain compliments appeared again and again, polished by use. Somewhere in medieval Europe, two people received letters describing their beauty in remarkably similar terms and never compared notes, and it was probably for the best. Romance felt personal to the person experiencing it, even when the language was shared. Then came the matter of delivery, which introduced a new layer of vulnerability. There was no reliable postal system for private correspondence. Letters traveled by messengers, friends, merchants, or anyone who owed you a favor and happened to be going in the right direction. Wax seals provided a sense of security, but only in theory. Anyone handling the letter could break it, read it, reseal it, or simply memorize its contents for later amusement. Privacy existed largely as an idea, and trust did most of the heavy lifting. Receiving a love letter was not always a quiet, solitary experience either. Letters were often read aloud, sometimes to family members, sometimes to friends, sometimes to a room full of people who felt entitled to an opinion. Romance was communal, whether anyone wanted it to be or not. Your most carefully chosen words might be analyzed, mocked, or misinterpreted by people who had no stake in your happiness, but plenty of interest in your drama. And yet, despite all of this, people kept writing, or rather, kept dictating, because the desire to be heard, truly heard, outweighed the discomfort. Love demanded expression, even when the method was flawed. There was courage in this, a quiet kind, the willingness to expose oneself emotionally in a world that offered very few protections. Medieval romance was not about secrecy or privacy. It was about persistence, about finding a way to communicate. Despite structural obstacles and social scrutiny. It is tempting to laugh at the absurdity of it, the awkward confessions, the monk acting as romantic middleman, the standardized metaphors, and there is humor there, dry and understated, but there is also something deeply human. These were people navigating desire within a system that did not prioritize their feelings, improvising intimacy in a culture that valued order and reputation above personal fulfillment. Love letters were risky, not just emotionally, but socially. A poorly worded phrase could damage a reputation, suggest impropriety, or invite unwanted attention. For women especially, being the recipient of a passionate letter could be dangerous. Evidence of temptation rather than affection, something to be managed carefully, explained away, or hidden entirely. For men, writing such a letter required confidence that the effort would not be used against them, that vulnerability would not become leverage. Still, the letters existed, fragile and hopeful, carried across muddy roads and uncertain distances, holding together a feeling that had no other way to travel. They were proof that even in a world defined by hierarchy, illiteracy, and constant surveillance, people found ways to articulate longing, to formalize affection, to insist that what they felt mattered enough to be written down, even if someone else had to do the writing. So, medieval romance was not silent, but it was rarely private. It unfolded in rooms that smelled of ink and parchment, under the watchful eyes of men sworn to higher callings, shaped by rules older than the people using them. It was careful, constrained, sometimes ridiculous, and yet undeniably sincere. Love survived not because the system supported it, but because people were stubborn enough to speak it aloud anyway, trusting that somewhere between the scribe's careful handwriting and the wax seal's fragile promise, their feelings might arrive intact. In the Middle Ages, to love someone was to accept an audience, to share your heart with at least one intermediary and several potential eavesdroppers, to hope that the words chosen on your behalf would carry the weight you intended. Romance did not whisper from behind closed doors. It cleared its throat, waited patiently, and dictated itself into history, one awkward sentence at a time. Left-handed, or how existing slightly wrong became a problem. Language has a way of revealing what people are afraid of long before they admit it, and in the Middle Ages, fear often hid comfortably inside words that sounded perfectly ordinary. The Latin word sinister simply meant left, nothing dramatic at first glance, just a direction, a way to orient the body in space. Unfortunately, it also came to mean unlucky, suspicious, morally questionable, and potentially dangerous, which is quite a burden for a single side of the human body to carry. If you were left-handed in medieval society, you were not immediately condemned, but you were noticed, and being noticed for the wrong reasons was rarely a good thing. People did not point and shout. They did something far more unsettling. They watched you a little longer, their eyes lingering just enough to suggest that something about you did not align properly with the world as they understood it. You were like a chair with 3 legs, technically functional, occasionally useful, but never something anyone fully trusted to hold their weight. The suspicion was not subtle, it was structural, built into medicine, religion, education, and daily custom. Medieval medical theory divided the human body into moral geography. The right side was warm, strong, balanced, associated with vitality and order, while the left was colder, weaker, prone to imbalance and failure. If something went wrong physically, the left side was an easy suspect, a convenient explanation that required no further investigation. After all, if the body itself leaned toward righteousness on one side and weakness on the other, then the case was already closed. Religion reinforced this idea with enthusiasm. Biblical imagery consistently favored the right, the righteous sat at the right hand of God, the blessed were separated from the condemned by direction, and the left became shorthand for deviation. This symbolism seeped quietly into everyday life, shaping instincts long before people could articulate them. Reaching for something with the left hand felt wrong, not because it failed, but because it contradicted a moral story everyone had agreed to believe. Education followed suit, such as it was. Children who showed a preference for their left hand were corrected, sometimes gently, sometimes not, encouraged to conform, retrained until their natural inclination felt like a bad habit. Writing, when taught, was designed for right-handed use. Tools favored it, gestures reinforced it. To be left-handed was to be constantly reminded that your body had made an incorrect choice before you were old enough to understand why it mattered. This unpredictability was what troubled people most. A left-handed person moved differently, wrote differently, worked differently, and difference was unsettling in a world that depended heavily on repetition and familiarity to function. Predictability was safety, routine was reassurance, and anyone who broke the pattern, even unintentionally, invited unease. Being unusual was suspicious. Being effective while unusual was worse because it challenged the logic that difference equaled deficiency. Superstition eagerly filled the gaps where explanation fell short. Left-handedness became associated with deceit, clumsiness, bad luck, and in extreme cases, proximity to darker forces. It was not that every left-handed person was accused of wrongdoing, but the groundwork was laid. The implication hovered quietly, waiting for something to go wrong. If an accident happened, if a tool failed, if a deal soured, the presence of someone already marked as slightly off could tip the narrative in an uncomfortable direction. Despite all this, left-handed people did not disappear. They adapted, often learning to use their right hand in public while relying on their left in private, becoming fluent in concealment long before anyone gave the concept a name. Survival favored flexibility, and medieval society, for all its rigidity, was full of people who learned how to exist within its expectations while quietly bending them. What is striking is how little effort was required to sustain this bias. No grand decree outlawed left-handedness, no formal punishment was needed, social pressure did the work efficiently, correction felt justified, suspicion felt reasonable, and the system reinforced itself without ever needing to acknowledge the harm it caused. Being left-handed was not a crime. It was a condition, one that required management, adjustment, and occasional apology. And yet, left-handed people persisted because bodies have a stubborn way of asserting themselves. Hands return to what feels natural when no one is watching. Muscles remember what minds are told to forget. In workshops, fields, kitchens, and private moments, the left hand continued its quiet rebellion, lifting, cutting, shaping the world in ways that contradicted the stories told about it. There is something deeply revealing in how much anxiety medieval society invested in something so small. A hand preference became a moral issue not because it truly mattered, but because it threatened the illusion of order. If even the human body could not be relied upon to follow the rules, then what could? Left-handedness was a reminder that difference existed without permission, that deviation did not always announce itself with drama. Sometimes it simply reached for a tool with the wrong hand. In the end, being left-handed in the Middle Ages was not a sentence, but it was a warning label. You existed, and that alone was slightly inconvenient for a world that preferred everything neatly aligned. You were tolerated, corrected, occasionally mocked, quietly distrusted, and expected to adjust. and most did because survival rarely rewards confrontation over something as simple as which hand you use. So if medieval society seemed uncomfortable with left-handed people, it was not really about the hand at all. It was about control, predictability, and the fear of things that did not behave as expected. To be left-handed was to remind the world that perfection was a fragile myth, and that even something as ordinary as a human body could refuse to cooperate. You existed, and for a culture built on order and symbolism, that was already asking quite a lot. What you look like. No one is quite sure, especially you. Modern people spend an extraordinary amount of time looking at themselves. Reflective surfaces follow us everywhere. Polished glass, phone screens, cameras quietly watching from every angle. We know our faces in intimate detail, sometimes better than we know our own thoughts. Medieval people did not have this problem, not because they were wiser, but because they lacked the necessary equipment to develop it. In the Middle Ages, knowing exactly what you look like was not a basic human experience. It was a luxury item. Mirrors existed, but they were rare, expensive, and temperamental, crafted from polished metal or early glass that distorted as much as it revealed. Owning one placed you firmly among the wealthy, the powerful, or at least the unusually fortunate. For everyone else, reflection came from water, and water was not designed for clarity. Ponds, wells, buckets, rivers, these were the closest most people ever came to seeing themselves, and none of them were particularly cooperative. You leaned forward cautiously because falling in was a real possibility, and what stared back was never stable. The surface rippled, shadows moved, light bent, and your face appeared stretched, narrowed, softened, or strangely melted depending on the angle. You did not linger. You glanced, accepted whatever vague shape appeared, and moved on. Staring too long risked slipping, drowning, or at the very least being caught doing something that looked suspiciously vain. This meant that medieval people did not grow up with a fixed mental image of themselves. There was no daily confirmation of symmetry or flaw, no slow accumulation of self-critique based on reflection. Your sense of identity was built outward, not inward, shaped by what you did, how you were known, and what others said about you. Appearance mattered, of course, but it mattered in a general, impressionistic way, not as a collection of precise details. Portraits existed, but they were not mirrors. They were aspirational documents, carefully constructed images meant to communicate status, virtue, and authority rather than accuracy. Faces were smoothed, expressions calmed, proportions adjusted to fit ideals rather than reality. Seeing your likeness in a painting did not tell you what you looked like. It told you how you were meant to be seen, which was a very different thing. For most people, vanity was not discouraged by moral teaching alone. It was discouraged by logistics. You cannot obsess over your jawline if you have never seen it clearly. You cannot fixate on wrinkles if you do not know exactly where they are. Self-consciousness requires access, and access required money. The vast majority of medieval society simply did not have the resources to develop the kind of visual self-awareness that modern culture treats as inevitable. As a result, judgment operated differently. People were evaluated through action, reputation, lineage, and presence. Could you work? Could you be trusted? Did your family have a history worth remembering? And perhaps most importantly, did you smell tolerable? Hygiene was inconsistent, but standards existed, and scent mattered more than subtle facial features. A person who worked hard, showed up reliably, and did not offend the senses was far more valuable than one who happened to have symmetrical bone structure. This created a strange kind of freedom. Without constant visual feedback, medieval people were not locked into the endless loop of self-correction that defines modern appearance anxiety. They did not perform for mirrors they did not own. Their bodies were tools first, symbols second. Scars indicated survival, not imperfection. Calloused hands were evidence of usefulness. Physical wear told a story that mattered more than how pleasing it looked. Of course, this did not mean appearance was irrelevant. Clothing, posture, grooming, and cleanliness signaled social position and intent. What you wore announced who you were allowed to be. But even here, the focus was external and functional rather than introspective. You dressed for others, not for yourself, to communicate status, obedience, or aspiration, not to express personal identity. The absence of clear self-reflection also meant that identity was less visually fixed. You could imagine yourself differently from how you appeared, and no reflective surface rushed to correct you. This gap between appearance and self-perception allowed people to inhabit roles without constant contradiction. You were what you did, not what you looked like doing it. The self was reinforced by memory and community, not by daily visual confirmation. There was also an underlying caution attached to looking too closely at oneself. Religious teaching warned against vanity, and staring into reflective surfaces carried symbolic weight. Water was associated with uncertainty, danger, and the boundary between worlds. To gaze too long at your reflection was not just impractical, it was unsettling, as though you might see something you were not meant to, or be drawn somewhere you could not return from. So medieval people developed a casual relationship with their own faces. They accepted the outline, trusted the descriptions of others, and focused their energy elsewhere. Life offered enough immediate concerns without adding self-scrutiny to the list. Hunger, labor, weather, and authority demanded attention. Reflection could wait, and often did, indefinitely. From a modern perspective, this seems almost peaceful, but it came with its own consequences. Without access to accurate self-images, people relied heavily on social feedback, and reputation carried enormous weight. If others said you looked sickly, untrustworthy, or out of place, you had little visual evidence to dispute it. Identity was negotiated collectively, not privately. Still, the medieval approach to appearance reveals something important. Obsession with looks is not an inherent human trait. It is a cultural habit enabled by technology. When mirrors are scarce, identity shifts inward and outward at the same time, anchored in action rather than image. People do not ask who they see when they look at themselves, because looking is not part of daily life. In the Middle Ages, you were judged by what you contributed, who you belonged to, and whether your presence made life easier or harder for those around you. It was a practical system, sometimes harsh, often unfair, but grounded in function rather than illusion. You did not need to know exactly what you looked like to survive. You needed to know how to work, how to endure, and how to remain useful in a world that offered very little reassurance. So when we imagine medieval people as unconcerned with appearance, it is not because they transcended vanity, it is because vanity requires tools they did not possess. Without mirrors, without constant reflection, the self remained slightly abstract, a story told through deeds instead of images. And in a world where survival demanded attention to everything else, that abstraction may have been one of the quiet mercies of medieval life. When objects had names because survival was personal. In the Middle Ages, objects were not passive, they were participants. Modern people treat tools as interchangeable, replaceable, easily discarded when they fail, but medieval life did not allow that kind of emotional distance. When your survival depended on a small collection of items, when your safety, food, warmth, and livelihood were tied directly to whether those things worked today, you learned very quickly to treat them with a kind of respect that looked suspiciously like affection. A sword was not just a sword. It was weight, balance, memory, and trust. It was the thing that stood between you and being erased from the world by someone who had one of their own. You did not swing it casually. You did not lend it without thought. And when it broke, you did not say the sword failed, you said you lost it, because that loss felt personal, intimate, like the disappearance of a companion who had carried you through moments that still echoed in your bones. Weapons were named not out of superstition, but out of recognition. Giving something a name is how humans acknowledge relationship. A named sword had history, victories, failures, and stories attached to it. It remembered battles and the nicks along its edge, sweat soaked into its grip, and the way it moved when your hands were shaking. Replacing it was not simple. Even if you found another blade, it would not be the same because it did not know you yet. The same logic applied to domestic tools. The oven was not just a structure of stone and heat. It was an unpredictable collaborator. Some days it behaved, holding temperature, baking evenly, providing bread that meant survival for another week. Other days it burned too hot, too cold, cracked at the wrong moment, and betrayed the effort invested in it. People spoke to ovens, cursed them, praised them, coaxed them like difficult co-workers. The relationship was ongoing and fragile. Doors had names because doors mattered. A good door kept danger out and warmth in. A bad one invited disaster. Hinges creaked like warnings. Locks failed at the worst possible times. When a door held through the night, it earned gratitude. When it failed, it was blamed as though it had chosen to. This was not foolishness, it was an intuitive understanding that materials have limits, personalities, and breaking points, and that acknowledging them was part of staying alive. Bells rang with intention. They announced time, danger, celebration, mourning. Their sound shaped the rhythm of daily life. A bell that rang too late or too early disrupted order. A cracked bell was mourned. Its voice was gone. People did not say the bell stopped working, they said it could no longer speak. In a world without constant written communication, sound carried authority, and the tools that produced it were treated accordingly. This habit of personifying objects was not driven by magical thinking, it was driven by necessity. When your environment is unstable, when every day presents new risks, you form attachments to anything that offers consistency. Tools that functioned became anchors. They were familiar in a world that rarely was. Naming them was a way of acknowledging that familiarity, of marking them as reliable, or at least known. Loss in the Middle Ages was constant. Crops failed, people died, homes burned, and through all of that, certain objects remained, carrying continuity through chaos. A pot passed down through generations, a blade reforged rather than replaced, a key that opened the same door long after the faces behind it had changed. These items absorbed memory. They were not alive, but they were not nothing. When an object broke, it created a gap that was not easily filled. Repair was preferred to replacement, not just because materials were scarce, but because repair preserved relationship. A mended tool retained its identity. A replacement had to earn trust all over again. This patience with objects reflected a broader, medieval attitude toward survival. You worked with what you had. You learned its limits. You adjusted your expectations. Critics might call this anthropomorphism, a projection of emotion onto the inanimate, but that assumes a distance medieval people did not experience. When an object's failure meant hunger, exposure, or death, treating it as emotionally neutral was a luxury. Emotional engagement was practical. It kept you attentive. It reminded you to care for the things that cared for you in their own limited, mechanical way. This mindset also shaped accountability. If something went wrong, blame was distributed carefully. Sometimes the object was at fault. Sometimes the user was. This negotiation created a sense of dialogue between human and tool. You learned to listen, to notice small changes, cracks, sounds, resistance. Awareness was survival. In naming their tools, medieval people acknowledged an uncomfortable truth. They were not self-sufficient. They depended on systems, materials, and craftsmanship beyond their control. The illusion of independence was not sustainable. Partnership, even with wood, metal, and stone, was unavoidable. So when someone said they had lost their sword, they were not being poetic. They were stating a fact about their diminished ability to exist safely in the world. The object was gone, and with it, a piece of their security. Grief was appropriate. In a modern world flooded with disposable goods, this intimacy with objects feels foreign, even sentimental. But in the Middle Ages, it was rational. When the margin between survival and collapse was thin, you learned to respect anything that kept you on the right side of it. You did not personify objects because you believed they had souls. You did it because they held yours together, day after fragile day. Shoes, or the thin line between continuing and ending early. In the Middle Ages, shoes were not an accessory. They were not a statement. They were not something you owned in multiples to match different moods. Shoes were survival equipment. They were the fragile barrier between the human body and a world that was cold, sharp, wet, and entirely indifferent to suffering. Without shoes, the ground became an enemy, and the enemy was very good at its job. Leather was expensive not because people valued fashion, but because producing usable leather required time, skill, animals, and patience. Tanning was slow, unpleasant, and dangerous work involving chemicals and processes that ruined hands and lungs. A skilled cobbler was not easily replaced, and a well-made pair of shoes represented a serious investment. You did not buy shoes casually. You acquired them carefully, and once you had them, you protected them like something alive. A single pair of shoes could last decades if cared for, repaired again and again, passed from parent to child, reshaped to fit new feet, patched until almost none of the original material remained visible. The shoe was no longer a product. It was a history of wear, each stitch marking a season survived. Throwing shoes away was unthinkable. Losing them was catastrophic. Walking barefoot was not a philosophical choice. It was a risk calculation that almost never favored optimism. In summer, bare feet met stones, thorns, animal waste, and sharp debris left by daily life. Cuts became infections. Infections became fevers. Fevers became endings. In winter, the danger was immediate and absolute. Frost did not negotiate. It did not care about poverty, faith, or effort. Exposed feet lost feeling, then color, then function. Once circulation failed, recovery was uncertain. Without modern medicine, frostbite was often permanent or fatal. Feet mattered because medieval life was built on walking. Work required movement. Markets, fields, water sources, churches, all demanded travel by foot. A person without functional feet was effectively removed from economic and social life. Injury was not just painful, it was isolating. One damaged foot could end a livelihood. One lost shoe could start that process. Shoes also shaped how far you could go and how often. Migration, pilgrimage, seasonal labor, all depended on footwear. A strong pair of shoes made movement possible. A weak one limited options. When people decided whether to leave, to travel, to seek work elsewhere, they considered their shoes as much as their supplies. You did not plan a journey without assessing the state of your soles. This made shoes emotionally charged objects. They were cared for, repaired, dried carefully near fires, greased against water, and stored with attention. Children learned early that shoes were not toys. Stepping into mud unnecessarily, wearing them indoors, or neglecting repairs was frowned upon. Shoes were not punished when they failed, but their failure was felt deeply. The loss of a single shoe was more than inconvenience. It disrupted balance, exposed one foot to danger, and forced a choice. Continue walking and risk injury, or stop and lose momentum. Either option carried consequences. Time lost could mean missing work, missing food, missing safety. A lost shoe could ripple outward, affecting an entire year's survival. Communities understood this. Charity often took the form of footwear. Shoes were given to the poor not as kindness but as investment. A shod person could work. A barefoot one became a burden. Providing shoes was practical compassion. Social status was also visible in shoes, not in style, but in condition. Well-maintained shoes suggested stability. Worn but intact shoes suggested resilience. No shoes at all suggested crisis. People noticed feet. They had to. Unlike clothing, shoes could not be easily adapted or shared. Ill-fitting shoes caused injury. Size mattered. Shape mattered. A shoe made for one foot did not easily accept another. This made theft complicated and recovery difficult. A stolen shoe was often useless to the thief and devastating to the owner. In colder regions, shoes were layered, stuffed with cloth or straw, anything to insulate against freezing ground. These improvisations were signs of ingenuity, not poverty. Survival required creativity. A person with warm feet could endure cold longer, work harder, and live. The quiet irony is that shoes rarely appear in heroic narratives of the Middle Ages. Swords and crowns get the attention. But it was shoes that determined whether someone could reach the battlefield, return home, or flee danger. They were unspectacular and essential. So when we think of medieval footwear, we should not imagine fashion, but function pressed to its limits. Shoes were not meant to impress. They were meant to hold together just long enough for life to continue. When they failed, the failure was intimate, immediate, and unforgiving. In a world where progress depended on movement, shoes were permission to exist beyond one place. They allowed escape, opportunity, and endurance. Losing them did not just slow you down. It threatened to end your story early, not with drama, but with cold, infection, and exhaustion. Medieval people knew this. They did not speak of shoes lightly. They cared for them with the seriousness we reserve for essential tools today, because they understood something simple and brutal. As long as your feet held out, life could continue. When they did not, everything else followed. Names, voices, and the fear of vanishing. More than death, medieval people feared something quieter, something slower, something that arrived without warning and left no mark on the body but erased everything else. To die was expected. Everyone died. Death was visible, ritualized, witnessed. Forgetting was worse. Forgetting was silent. Forgetting meant that whatever you had been simply dissolved, not violently but politely, as if you had never mattered enough to interrupt the world. In a society where memory lived mostly in people and not in paper, vanishing was frighteningly easy. Paper rotted, ink faded, stone cracked. But a spoken name, repeated often enough, could outlast them all. A name was not decoration, it was storage. It was a container that held stories, obligations, reputation, and identity. Medieval people did not repeat names because they lacked creativity. They repeated names because repetition was how you stayed alive. When a child was named after a parent or grandparent, it was not sentimental nostalgia. It was continuity management. The name carried weight, it carried expectation. It allowed the dead to keep circulating quietly through the living. You did not invent new names lightly because inventing meant risking forgetfulness. Recycling names meant recycling people. As long as someone spoke your name, you existed in some form, not physically but socially. And social existence mattered more than inner feelings or private identity. Identity was not something you owned alone. It belonged to the community that remembered you. If no one remembered you, no one could pray for you. No one could tell stories about you. No one could explain who you had been. You slipped out of the human record entirely. This fear shaped daily behavior in ways that feel strange to modern ears. Medieval people talked constantly, not because they loved conversation, but because silence was unsettling. Speech confirmed presence. Talking proved that the world was still populated. People narrated their work out loud, complained audibly, sang while walking, muttered prayers under their breath. A quiet person was suspicious. Silence suggested withdrawal. Withdrawal suggested absence. Absence invited fear. At night, this anxiety deepened. Darkness swallowed sound. Shadows erased boundaries. Voices became anchors. People slept together when possible, not out of intimacy but reassurance. Hearing another person breathe, cough, turn in their sleep, meant the world had not emptied while you were unconscious. To wake alone in silence was disturbing. It felt too close to being forgotten. Even prayer was meant to be heard. Silent prayer existed, but spoken prayer carried authority. Words spoken aloud had weight. They filled space. They could be overheard by God, saints, angels, or anything else that might be listening. A prayer trapped inside the mind risked being missed entirely. If God was busy, you wanted to make sure your request was audible. Songs served the same function. Ballads, chants, work songs, lullabies were memory tools. They repeated names, events, places. A song could outlive the singer, and that was the point. When you sang a story, you anchored it somewhere outside yourself. You turned memory into sound, and sound into survival. Genealogy mattered deeply for this reason. Knowing who begat whom was not trivia. It was proof that the chain had not broken. Each generation spoken aloud reinforced the idea that the line continued. Forgetting an ancestor was not just impolite, it was dangerous. It weakened the structure that held identity together. Even ordinary greetings carried meaning. Saying someone's name when you addressed them was an act of recognition. It confirmed their place in the social world. To be greeted was reassurance that you were still visible. To be ignored felt like erosion. Politeness was not about kindness. It was about acknowledgement. Sneezing, oddly enough, sat at the intersection of habit and fear. A sneeze looked violent. Breath escaped the body suddenly and uncontrollably. In a culture where breath was closely linked to the soul, this was alarming. If no one responded, no blessing spoken, something might leave without supervision. Saying, "God bless you," was not courtesy. It was damage control. It was a quick, verbal net thrown over the moment to keep everything where it belonged. Illness intensified this anxiety. Sick people were watched closely, not just for physical symptoms, but for sound. A quiet sick room was ominous. Talking to the ill, even when they could not respond, kept them anchored. Silence suggested slipping. Noise suggested resistance. Names were spoken deliberately at moments of transition, births, marriages, deaths. Saying a name out loud fixed it in place. The dead were named repeatedly, at funerals, in prayers, on anniversaries. To stop naming the dead was to abandon them twice, once to death, once to forgetting. This fear explains medieval discomfort with anonymity. Anonymous figures were unsettling. Masks, disguises, unknown travelers, all carried risk. If you did not know someone's name, you could not place them. If you could not place them, you could not predict them. People without names existed outside the web of memory that kept society stable. Writing, when it appeared, was first used to record names. Lists, rolls, registers, genealogies. Writing froze what voices might forget, but writing was fragile, expensive, and inaccessible. Speech remained primary. Memory stayed communal. Even insults served a purpose. Being cursed meant you were acknowledged. Anger recognized presence. Indifference erased it. Medieval conflicts were loud for a reason. Silence was too close to non-existence. Legacy was understood differently. Few expected monuments. Most hoped for mention. To be remembered as someone who lived here, someone's father, the woman who baked well, was enough. Identity did not require grandeur. It required repetition. This is why medieval life was noisy. Sound stitched people into existence. Voices proved continuity. Names kept souls circulating. Forgetting was the true ending, the one without witnesses. Politeness, therefore, was not optional. It was existential. Responding when spoken to. Blessing a sneeze. Answering a call. These were acts of recognition. They said, "I see you. You are still here." And as long as someone said your name, even softly, even incorrectly, even in passing, you had not vanished yet. Women, beauty, and the price of being seen. In Tudor society, beauty was not a gift. It was not luck. It was not something you casually enjoyed in a mirror before moving on with your day. Beauty was a responsibility assigned early, monitored constantly, and punished without hesitation when it failed to behave correctly. To be beautiful was not to be free, it was to be watched. A woman's appearance was never neutral. It spoke before she did. It testified on her behalf and often against her. Pale skin was not just an aesthetic preference, it was a declaration of class. It said you belonged indoors, protected from the sun, removed from labor, and therefore respectable. Darkened skin suggested work, exposure, independence, and proximity to survival, all qualities that made society uncomfortable when found in women. Hair mattered just as much. Its color, texture, and arrangement were red-like signals. Fair hair implied youth, purity, and gentleness. Darker hair carried ambiguity. Red hair wandered dangerously close to moral suspicion, depending on who was judging and on what day. Hair was never just hair. It was biography. Age was the most dangerous feature of all. Youth was prized not for innocence, but for potential. Fertility mattered. Obedience was assumed. Aging, on the other hand, was not treated as natural progression. It was treated as failure. Wrinkles were not signs of experience. They were evidence of decline. A woman growing older was not becoming wiser. She was becoming inconvenient. Beauty brought attention. Attention brought power. And power, when possessed by women, made men nervous. This tension defined the entire system. A beautiful woman could influence decisions, redirect desire, shape alliances. She could soften resistance or provoke jealousy. Her face could open doors that arguments could not. And because of this, her beauty was treated as both valuable and dangerous. Too beautiful, and suspicion followed. Why was she so captivating? What was she hiding? What was she trying to control? Beauty implied manipulation. It implied temptation. It implied moral instability. A woman who drew attention too easily was assumed to enjoy it, and enjoyment itself was considered evidence of corruption. But to lose beauty was worse. As youth faded, protection faded with it. Older women were not gently reclassified as dignified or wise. They were often pushed toward invisibility, or worse, caricature. Age was associated with bitterness, lust, manipulation, and disorder. The older woman became a warning rather than a model. This fear hovered constantly. Women knew their value was fragile. Beauty offered access, but only temporarily. Once it faded, there was rarely anything waiting to replace it. Authority, wisdom, competence, these were not reliable substitutes. Appearance was the currency. Everything else was supplemental. Noble women felt this pressure most intensely. Their bodies were not private. They were political assets. Marriage negotiations revolved around appearance as much as land or money. A favorable face could amplify a modest dowry. An unfavorable one could end negotiations before they began. Rejection was rarely explicit. Silence followed instead. Silence was more brutal. Queens experienced this scrutiny on an entirely different level. Their appearance carried national meaning. Beauty signaled divine favor. Fertility promised stability. Aging suggested danger. Every change in a queen's body was observed, discussed, interpreted. Miscarriages became public commentary. Weight changes became political ammunition. Wrinkles became evidence of decline, not just personal, but dynastic. Portraits were diplomatic tools. They were carefully managed, softened, adjusted. These images traveled before the woman herself, establishing expectations that reality was required to meet. Failure to match the portrait could destabilize alliances. Art was not representation, it was negotiation. Beauty standards were contradictory by design. A woman was expected to appear effortlessly pure, as though nature had simply chosen her. But achieving this appearance required enormous effort. Skin was lightened with powders and mixtures that damaged it over time. Hair was lightened with herbal rinses, sunlight, and alkaline solutions that weakened and broke it. Wigs and hairpieces filled the gaps left behind. Makeup existed, but its use was dangerous. Too much suggested deception, too little suggested neglect. The ideal was plausibility. A woman had to look as though she had done nothing at all. Any visible effort risked accusation. Altering appearance could be read as moral fraud, as if enhancing the body revealed corruption beneath the surface. Women learned to manage attention carefully. Compliments were deflected, praise was denied, admiration was treated as a threat rather than a reward. Confidence was masked as humility. Skill was reframed as duty. A woman who appeared aware of her beauty risked being judged for enjoying it. Speech followed similar rules. Women learned when to remain silent and when to speak indirectly. Direct assertion was risky. It could be interpreted as ambition. Ambition in women was suspicious. Indirect influence was safer. Suggestion instead of command. Agreement instead of leadership. Clothing was regulated to enforce hierarchy. Sumptuary laws dictated fabrics, colors, and styles based on class. These rules were not about fashion. They were about containment. A woman was not meant to confuse social boundaries through appearance. Looking too refined could be interpreted as aspiration. Aspiration was dangerous. At court, this control intensified. Visibility equaled influence. A woman who attracted attention could shape conversations, redirect favor, build alliances. Beauty became a language through which power was negotiated among men. Women bore the consequences, but the system served male insecurity as much as male dominance. Yet within these constraints, women found strategies. Appearance became armor. Beauty could be softened to appear harmless. Youth could be extended artificially to delay marginalization. Presentation could be adjusted depending on audience. Survival required flexibility. This was not vanity, it was risk management. Looking acceptable was safer than looking honest. A woman who blended into expectation avoided scrutiny. A woman who stood out invited judgment. Every choice carried potential consequence. Beauty constrained women, but it also gave them tools. Used carefully, appearance could protect, influence, and occasionally subvert the rules meant to confine it. Women learned to navigate this terrain with precision, balancing visibility and restraint. By the end of the Tudor period, one truth remained clear. Beauty was never neutral. It offered access, visibility, and influence, but it also placed women under constant surveillance. What appeared to be power was fragile and conditional. Once beauty faded, authority rarely followed. For many women, beauty was their most visible asset and their most unstable one. It could open doors and close futures. It could shield and expose. It demanded constant labor while pretending effort did not exist. In this world, being seen was not always a privilege. Sometimes, it was the most dangerous thing of all. People do not change. Only the stage does. When you pull back far enough, when you stop squinting at dates and dynasties, and let the noise blur into a low hum, something uncomfortable becomes obvious. People do not change. The costumes change, the buildings change, the gods get renamed. The lighting improves slightly, but the people underneath remain stubbornly familiar. From the medieval village to the Greek city-state to the Roman forum, the pattern repeats with unsettling consistency. People gather, they compete, they drink, they argue, they tell stories about why things are the way they are, and they cling to the quiet belief that if the correct ritual is performed, if the proper words are spoken, tomorrow will be survivable. History likes to present itself as a parade of disasters, wars, plagues, collapses, fires, invasions. That makes for clean storytelling. It also misses most of what actually happened. The majority of historical time was made of ordinary days, days where nothing legendary occurred, days where people worried about food, reputation, weather, and whether their neighbor was quietly doing better than they were. Ancient Greeks gathered for games not because they loved exercise, but because competition created meaning. To run faster than someone else, to throw farther, to sing better, to wrestle harder was proof that effort mattered. Victories were not just personal. They belonged to families, cities, gods. Losing was not humiliation. It was instruction. The gods had spoken. Try again later. Romans refined this instinct into infrastructure. They built arenas, roads, baths, taverns, places to gather, watch, argue, drink, and be seen. Wine flowed constantly, but never freely. It was diluted, measured, supervised. Enjoyment was permitted only if it remained controlled. Excess was dangerous. Discipline mattered. Even pleasure required rules. Medieval Europeans inherited all of this, whether they admitted it or not. Festivals replaced games. Saints replaced gods. Taverns replaced symposiums. But the structure stayed the same. Gatherings mattered. Shared experience stabilized uncertainty. If everyone celebrated the same feast day, maybe the world was still coherent. Across all these societies, rituals filled the gaps where certainty failed. People did not know why crops failed or illness spread or storms destroyed everything overnight. So they created explanations. They named forces. They assigned blame. They invented rules that suggested order existed, even if they could not see it. Superstition was not stupidity, it was pattern recognition under pressure. When you lack reliable information, you work with repetition. If something bad happened after a certain action, you avoided that action. If something good followed a ritual, you repeated it. Over time, habit became belief. Belief became culture. This is why calendars mattered so much. Lucky days, unlucky days, days to travel, days to stay home, days to cut hair, days to avoid blood. Organizing time made chaos feel manageable. When the future is unstable, structure feels like control. People talked themselves through uncertainty. Stories explained what logic could not. Myths filled emotional gaps. Even exaggerated tales served a purpose. They warned, they entertained, they reassured. A story with a clear ending was comforting in a world where most endings were abrupt and unexplained. Alcohol played a familiar role across eras. Greeks mixed wine with water. Romans insisted on dilution. Medieval ale was safer than water. Drinking was communal, regulated, ritualized. It loosened conversation without dissolving structure. It allowed people to speak more honestly without completely losing control. Ideally, Gossip functioned as information exchange. It traveled faster than official news. It carried warnings, reputations, speculation. It was messy, unreliable, and essential. Knowing who to trust mattered more than knowing what was true. Authority remained fragile everywhere. Kings, emperors, councils, priests all relied on performance as much as power. Ceremonies, clothing, titles, gestures. Authority had to be visible to be believed. Once it looked uncertain, it weakened quickly. Fear shaped behavior more than ideology. Fear of hunger, fear of exclusion, fear of being remembered incorrectly or not at all. People adapted not because they were resilient heroes, but because they had no alternative. Survival encouraged creativity. What changes across history is not human nature, but the scale of consequence. A bad decision in a village affected dozens. A bad decision in an empire affected millions. The emotional logic remained identical. Protect resources, maintain reputation, secure alliances, avoid shame, hope for stability. Modern people like to imagine that earlier societies were uniquely irrational. They believed strange things. They trusted rituals. They feared omens. This interpretation is comforting because it creates distance. It suggests progress has cured uncertainty. It has not. It has only changed its shape. Today, people still gather. They still compete. They still follow rituals. They still believe that if they say the right words, click the right button, follow the correct routine, tomorrow will be manageable. The technology is different. The anxiety is not. History was not an endless parade of misery. It was a long stretch of ordinary life interrupted by occasional catastrophe. Most people laughed more often than they screamed. They loved, they complained, they adapted. They made jokes about things they could not fix. Absurd solutions often worked better than none. Naming objects, blessing sneezes, avoiding unlucky days, talking into silence. These behaviors created psychological stability. Stability allowed survival. Survival allowed continuity. People were not ignorant. They were operating with limited information in unstable environments. They built systems that made sense to them, and those systems worked just well enough to keep things moving. The real thread connecting eras is not suffering. It is persistence. Humans continue. They adjust. They reinterpret meaning. They carry stories forward. They leave marks where they can. Names, songs, rituals, ruins. And beneath all of it sits the quiet hope that someone will remember, that voices will repeat familiar patterns, that names will be spoken again, that existence will echo just a little longer. History does not move forward cleanly. It circles, it stumbles, it repeats itself with new vocabulary. People remain complicated, anxious, inventive, stubborn, and strangely hopeful. In the darkness of uncertainty, across centuries and continents, humans do the same small, defiant thing. They keep living. They keep telling stories, and they hope quietly that someone is still listening. A quiet ending before the world starts again. If you've stayed this long, if your mind is drifting but not quite asleep yet, you've done something very medieval without realizing it. You've sat in the dark and listened to stories, not because they promised answers, but because they made the uncertainty feel shared. That alone has always been enough to get people through the night. History despite how it's packaged, was never meant to impress. It was meant to reassure, not in the comforting way, but in the honest way, the kind that says, yes, things were strange, uncomfortable, sometimes ridiculous, and yet people managed. They complained, they adapted, they named their tools, blamed their calendars, blessed their sneezes, and kept going anyway. The past doesn't look calmer because it was better. It looks calmer because it's finished. The noise has settled, the arguments ended, the worries either resolved or disappeared along with the people who carried them. What remains are patterns. Familiar ones. People moved when staying felt dangerous. They loved even when it was inconvenient. They feared being forgotten more than being wrong. They built meaning out of repetition, ritual, and a little superstition, because control, even imaginary control, was better than none. They weren't waiting for history to happen. They were trying to survive tomorrow, just like everyone else. So if any of this felt oddly familiar, if the anxieties sounded modern, if the habits felt recognizable, that's not coincidence. That's continuity. You're not as far from them as you think. You just have better lighting and fewer reasons to bless a sneeze. Usually. The medieval world wasn't full of tragedy all the time. It was full of ordinary people managing unstable systems with creativity, humor, and stubbornness. They weren't foolish. They were practical. They worked with what they had. And sometimes what they had was a story, a name, or a ritual whispered into the dark. Which brings us here, a quiet moment, a pause before sleep, the modern version of sitting by a fire and listening to someone talk until your thoughts slow down enough to rest. If the past teaches us anything at this hour, it's this. You don't need certainty to continue. You just need enough light to take the next step, enough sound to remind you you're not alone, and enough memory to believe you matter. So wherever you are, whatever time it is, let the noise fade. The world will still be there in the morning, slightly strange, mildly unreasonable, and very human. Thank you for listening. Thank you for remembering. And now, gently, without ceremony, good night.